Hello, thank you so much for coming to our first event of the New Voices on Eurasia speaker series. My name is David Ciccone, and I'm an associate professor of political science here at George Washington University and co-director of PONARS Eurasia, which is sponsoring this event. PONARS, if you're not well aware, is a network of about 150 academics working around the world on all different types of issues related to Eurasia, broadly defined. This event, New Voices on Eurasia, brings some of our younger scholars or future scholars, up-and-coming academics to Washington, D.C. to deliver a public talk on some of their more exciting academic insights. We have sociologists, political scientists, economists, international relations scholars, the whole gamut. And we're delighted to have Natalia Savelyeva, who is a sociologist joining us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We also conduct research at the Public Sociology Laboratory. PhD is from the Russian Academy of Sciences. And really some of the best work that I'm aware of studying contemporary Russian public opinion with a real kind of fine-grained and careful attention to the dynamics on the ground. And she's going to be sharing some of her research on the relatives and wives of soldiers that are currently fighting in Russia's war in Ukraine. Generally, we have about an hour for this talk, and we're going to give about 30 to 40 minutes to Natalia to deliver some opening remarks and a presentation. And then we have a lot of people joining us online and lots of time for question and answer in, say, the last 20 minutes. So please save your questions for the end, and I'll moderate that discussion. But without further ado, thank you so much, Natalia, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here again. So yeah, today I will tell about the new project of Public Sociology Laboratory. That's an independent research group. We do a lot of studies about how Russians now perceive the war, what is the dynamic of this perception. And our recent project was dedicated to relatives and wives of soldiers, and we were trying to understand, like, okay, so how actually the experiences of like having a relative in the Russian army affected their political attitudes. They also contacted some NGOs like soldiers' mothers and organizations who were trying to like help relatives and soldiers themselves. So yeah, we were just trying to figure out what is it going on with their lives when their relatives or their husbands got taken by Russian army. And of course, there is like this big question there, right, which has already been there for the last 2 years, which is like, why Russians do not protest. I think it's more or less clear why right now, right? So because the political circumstances actually are not very favorable for organization of any public movement because of like repressions. It's very dangerous. But still, we have one case which is included. Oh, why it's not moving? Oh, yes, it's moving. So yeah, we have one case which is included in this study. This is the case of the movement Put Домой, bring them home, right? And actually, this one is, I would say that's the only one movement right now in Russia, which is openly and publicly wants something from Putin, from Russian state, from Russian army, and they criticize Russian army and Russian state. And they still organize some public manifestations, some public protest actions. So the recent one happened on 21st of September in Moscow, when the participants of this action, there was not that many of them. There was like around 15 women there, I guess, who came to the Ministry of Defense like from all over the country, so they were detained. But still, that's pretty amazing that we have some public protest in Russia. And the question is, how is that possible? Why some relatives of soldiers protest, others do not? The other question here is that, like, traditionally in Russia, starting from Chechen War from 90s, we had a tradition of public protest of soldiers' wives, right? That was super strong during the Chechen War, and still we have several. We have a committee of mothers of St. Petersburg, and like another one in Moscow, and like the union of committees, something like that. So we have like committees of mothers, but somehow now mothers, they are not on the avant-garde of the protest related to mobilization. And that's another kind of like question which I at least will try to answer during this presentation. So why some groups of people do protest and others, and it seems that like wives, mothers, there are a lot of similarities there, right? So why, yeah, but they don't. So that's my focus for today. So what we did for this project, it's a relatively small project. What we did around 30 interviews. We talked to different groups of people. So half of those interviews were conducted with participants of Bring Them Home movement, so mostly wives, but there was one mother there too. The other half was conducted with, so I call them in this presentation relatives of soldiers, but that's not only relatives. It's like mothers, daughters, fathers, also friends of people who were mobilized, drafted, or joined Russian army as military volunteers, right? And how we analyzed those, so we collected those interviews that took like 6 months to collect them. So from the last autumn to the last spring. And so my focus here will be on the trajectories of like mobilization or just action, not mobilization, of those different groups of people. So I just want to understand how it happens or not happens that people start participating in protest actions and criticize the state, or they don't. So what are the steps behind like those two processes? Also, of course, we focused, so the other question we were trying to answer is like, okay, so how actually the experience of dealing with the state, right, trying to get your husband or son or father back from the army, how did this experience affect the attitudes of those relatives and wives about the state? So did it make them to review what they thought before about the war and Russian state, or maybe that actually didn't change much their opinions? And we have like both actually results here, right? Yeah, and as I said, there are two groups of people, and I want to start with the first one. Like we call them relatives, but it's not only, I would just, for like to be quick, I will continue calling them relatives, but that's like mothers, fathers, daughters, and friends of soldiers who were either drafted, so there were mothers who were trying to help somehow their sons who just were drafted. They were not necessarily participating in the war, right? And they like was going to come back after 1 year of their service. So there was also mobilized soldiers there, one mother of mobilized soldiers, one ex-wife of mobilized soldiers, and like a friend of mobilized soldiers. So those soldiers, they were mobilized in autumn 2022. There was two fathers of contracted soldiers who signed a contract to participate in the war, right? And there was two daughters of military volunteers. So their fathers, who they were like in their 50s, they decided to join the Russian army either before mobilization or after mobilization, like, and they had mostly like ideological reasons for that, right? To defend people in Donbass. So we also, for this group, to understand their trajectories, we divided them into two subgroups. Like in one subgroup, there was opposers of the war, so people who were against the war, as they said, pretty much from the very beginning, not necessarily very politically involved or politicized, but like they had their opinions about the war, right? The other group was the group of non-opposers. So there was people who maybe not necessarily had like a strong opinion in support of the war, who was like, oh yeah, this war is very good, I just love that, but they were not opposers, right? So they were not against, so they just were able to find some justifications in order to explain, so why do we have this war, why it makes sense. And so not necessarily they were like all excited about that, like no, but they had some like justifications in their head. So, and what is important here, that those two groups of people, they had pretty like different trajectories in terms like what they did in order to help their relatives. So first interesting difference here is that, so in the group of non-opposers, like the most of the mothers we had in the group of the non-opposers, right? So the first interesting thing is that Apparently, not surprisingly though, that opposers and non-opposers, they kind of were, they tried to use different methods in order to achieve their goals. So non-opposers, they were trying to use only legitimate and legal methods, right? So they just call to all the ministries, all those organizations related to Russian army, wrote official requests and things like that. Well, sometimes they even like initiated court cases, but yeah, that was it. But opposers, they were up to, so they also tried some legitimate methods, right? But they, since they never were very, since they never had very high opinion about Russian state and like their capacity to do something there, so they were much more open for using, so to say, like illegal or illegitimate methods. So they were like, okay, so I will try to convince my husband, when my father, when he come back, to become never come back to Russian army. We'll try to hide them. We'll try to kind of like help him to cross the border and things like that. So maybe just I will convince him to go to prison, but not to come back to the war. So they were, so the first difference we see here is just this difference in the methods they were ready to use. Though there were some similarities, and the similarity was that they were involved, and at different points of their like trajectory, they were involved in different initiatives, like they were trying to give an advice or receive an advice from people who were in a very similar situation, but they never tried to like participate in some collective form of action, and they were in general not interested in it. Like neither people who were opposers, neither non-opposers, so both of them, they were kind of like stayed within very individualized trajectory, only occasionally seeking for help and giving help to others. And the interesting thing is, well, you can expect that like those who were opposers before the war, they didn't change much their opinion about the Russian state and the war, because they were already pretty like skeptical about everything. But the interesting thing that non-opposers, mostly the mothers whose sons were in the Russian army, some of them were mobilized, some of them were just draft soldiers, and like the cases there are just horrible, honestly. The cases usually it's something that those sons, they already had pretty bad health conditions. They never even had to be drafted, so like they shouldn't be in army, like first of all, right? So when they got to Russian army, of course their health got much worse, and basically what their mothers tried to do, they just tried to save lives and like what it was left from the health of their sons there, right? So like the cases there are just horrible. Yeah, but still non-opposers, they didn't change much their attitudes toward the state and toward the Russian army. All that despite the dramatic just consequences of army service for the health of their sons, and despite the fact that basically like their interaction with the state structure, that was not very joyful, and so yeah, that was just normal, like yeah, so that was not very helpful for them, and sometimes very disappointing too. And what was interesting, if we look just at this subgroup of mothers who supported in general, who did not oppose the war, so they shared very similar attitude toward the state from the very beginning. Like first, they had this belief that when I asked them, so yeah, remember, so their sons, they shouldn't be in the army because of health issues. They just never should just be there. But despite of that, when I asked them, so like, okay, but did you think about maybe like just not going there, find any other like illegal ways, just maybe to hide your son or wherever, initiate some legal process to just not let your son go to the army? They said like, no, because I mean, we have no right to say no, because nada значит nada. If it has to be done, it has to be done. And like this quote, this one is actually from the interview of the mother of mobilized soldiers. soldier, and she like literally in this short piece, she's 3 times she says like with different words like nada значит nada. It has to be, then it has to be that he said that he should go there, then that means she should go there. The motherland says it has to be done, it has to be done, and things like that. So they had a kind of like very strong loyalty to the state in terms of just it has to be done, right? So yeah, we cannot say no. Doesn't matter what are the circumstances, doesn't matter what's going on, how dangerous it is for my son, but we cannot say no just because that's the state and because we are the citizens. And that sort of was the part of their dignity. They were almost proud that their sons went to the army. They were like, of course, he didn't try to hide. He's a man. What kind of man would hide behind the mother's skirt? Of course, he went to the army, but yes. And even I asked another woman, and like, yeah, she got back her son, but he just basically, yeah, his health was just completely destroyed, and her whole experience of this year while he was trying to get him back was just horrible. And I asked her, so, well, what do you think about Russian army now? You had such a horrible experience. And she said like, well, you know what? So there are some, I mean, there are some things which should be improved in the Russian army, but I believe that's super important for every man to go to the Russian army, because that's how a man is growing up. That's how he gets this very important experience of becoming a man, right? So yeah, like I got my son basically disabled from this army, but I still believe that that's an important part. So what they had in common is this kind of very deep loyalty, like, yes, we just have to do that, defend motherland. That's our, that's just what we have to do. The other very interesting thing, which also was common for those mothers in the group of non-opposers, is that, yeah, they experienced they had a lot of like very bad experiences with interaction with the Russian army. And a lot of like, it was very hard for them, right? So they got depressed over this year because just they were basically had to like helplessly observe how they just sons losing whatever their bodies, their ability to speak and things like that. And we also asked the question like, yeah, look, this experience, how did it affect you, right? Does it worth doing anything about that? And this is again the answer of this mother whose son was mobilized and who is still in the army, and she cannot, so he got a trauma there and he's in the hospital now, but she cannot get him back. She cannot get any money for the future, because now he probably will be like his life will be limited in the future, right? And she says, so she's trying to answer this question. She obviously tried to say like, well, I didn't like it, right? So, but she is like, well, how should I answer this question correctly? And then she goes not to her own emotions and not to her upsets with like particular people or particular state institutions or particular cases of interaction. He goes to her father's words, which is like, daughter, there is no truth, and there will never be, especially in the war, right? And then she goes on and on that like, of course I was upset, but this sadness and this like depression and this unsatisfaction, this grief, that was not directed, right? So there was not, she didn't blame anyone. So yeah, she said like, horrible. Yes, of course I am horrified by this experience, but she never blamed anyone. No Putin, no like Ministry of Defense, like no state institution, like no one. It's sort of, she was talking about that experiences the same as like other mothers of soldiers were talking about their experiences, like, well, yeah, life is bad. Well, yeah, that's unfair. Like it is unfair just by design, right? By itself. So that was a common thing for these groups of mothers of Russian soldiers, which makes them pretty different from our second big group, which were analyzed, which were the wives of soldiers who were the members of the Bring Them Home movement. So first, the trajectory of those women, there was not just trajectory of action when they go like from the problem to like trying to do some actions and then just at the end something happens, right? So that trajectory was basically the trajectory of radicalization. So first, despite their views, some of them were like more like Putin lovers, and some of them were like actually pro-war right at the beginning, right? Some of them were against the war, but all of them, despite their views, that the first step they try to do, the first thing they try to do, they try to reason out the husbands of joining Russian army. So just even like if they like Putin or they were like, yeah, we need this war, they're like, yeah, but maybe you should not go there. So that was very common for all of them. So yeah, but they like husbands, they joined Russian army, and pretty much all of them then was sent to the front line. So they participated in actual fight, and some of them they were the part of those meat storms, right? When they just send soldiers and they just all get killed, right? So the second step, like within like 6 months, the next step of their trajectory, so they were trying to clarify the situation because they had this like impression from the very beginning that their husbands were taking only for some time. For whatever reason, sometimes there was like an explicit promise, right? Sometimes it was just kind of like a feeling, right, that everything will be over soon, or there will be a rotation or something like that. So step number 2, they're trying to figure out actually what kind of rights their husbands have when they will come back home, when they will have just anything there, what is actually their future, right? And they start also writing those requests, calling those different people who are serving, who working for Russian army. And the interesting thing is that they're trying to do that together. So like in a very quick manner, they find some other wives with whom that can be their small village or their city. So they find someone with whom they start doing all those things. They're going to meet the deputies, they just sign the petitions. So like already in the second step, they move to this collective action, though it's not protest action there. So, and there was a third step. The third step was basically this turn toward radicalization. So after a year of the attempts to get their husbands back and to figure out when they can get them back, they understood that they would never get them back until the war is over, right? And like last autumn 2023, they kind of like came to this realization. It was also like 1 year since the partial mobilization has started. And then there was, in November, there was this direct line when Putin is talking to citizens of Russia, right, answer their questions. And they send a lot of questions to Putin there. They ask their husbands and like other men with whom they served in the army also to send questions. The question was only one. So like when this partial mobilization will be over and we go home, there will be a rotation, or like what is the plan there, right? And Putin, he completely ignored. He completely ignored the question of mobilization, soldiers or whatever. And that made them, the wives of those mobilized soldiers, that made them just both depressed, angry, and furious. So they felt this like very powerful mix of emotions. So helplessness, powerlessness, but at the same time, they also realized that, okay, there is no other options there. So whatever we try to do there according to the law, whatever, it just doesn't work. Nobody cares about us, right? So, and that was the moment when when the movement itself became radicalized in terms that they started publishing in their Telegram. Basically, they started criticizing Putin openly and Shoigu and Ministry of Defense and saying like things like, okay, like this war, why we're fighting that? So who is interested in that? Why Putin is not saying anything about that? So, and the important thing is that within this group, again, we had women who had different political attitudes. So some of them, they were opposers of the war, they were against the war from the very beginning. Some of them were not, right? So they were fine. But those differences, they actually are not important for their trajectory. So the trajectory is those 3 steps, from just trying to reason out their husbands to action to radicalization. That was pretty much the same for all of them, despite their views. So how this mobilization became possible. So the first thing there is that I think that this is there is a lot of irony in this the whole concept of like partial mobilization, right? So why? Because the partial mobilization affected only some people in Russia, right? So in all the interviews, those women, they said like, okay, so I sent my husband there, right? Now I cannot get him back. But look around, I look at my friends, they're fine, their lives goes as usual, right? Everybody's celebrating New Year, everybody's celebrating everything, everybody is fine, they're just living their lives, but that's only us who are suffering here. The second thing is that wives who participated in this movement with whom we talked, they got very involved with the experiences of their husbands. So one of them said like, well, my husband is a hostage there now because she cannot leave the army. But actually they were hostages too, because they were talking to their husbands. And basically when their husbands left, their life was over, right? So many of them said something like, my life is currently on hold for like a year or two. I just cannot leave anymore. I cannot do anymore. I cannot really work anymore. I have a child, many of them have children, so that also kind of like, they say like, I didn't expect that I will raise my child alone by myself. I didn't plan that, absolutely. But yeah, I just feel that my life, my normal life was taken away by the state, by Putin. So yeah, how should I live with that, right? And this experience of being only like sort of outcasts. So basically what they did with this partial mobilization, they created a group of outcasts, right? Who just constantly, day after day, observe how other people live normal life as if war is not happening, but they are the one who pay for this war with the life of their husbands, with their own lives, with the lives of their kids, right? And that kind of created an important impact into this boundary work, which was just made within the movement by those women, right? So first, they were very articulate about this just boundary between them and the other society. So people, they look at them, their life goes as usual, but they suffer, right? So they kind of like, there was constant, they experienced this mismatch like constantly in their everyday life. The second boundary was that like wives against the state, because like first the experiences of interaction with those different representatives of the state who basically never replied to any of their demands, and they realized that like, yeah, they cannot do anything like just using the means that they're provided by the state, but also because the state at some point, they started attacking this movement, right? So in the media, through those pro-war bloggers, they start saying that like, yeah, they work for Ukrainians, they are Navalnyists, they're getting money from the United States, obviously, like CISPO is there, and things like that. And also, they started like posting the crazy stories about like participants. So there's just like personally attacking participants of this movement. Of course, state officials started coming to those women, obviously, like police officers, like, you know, we're checking out what's going there, like social services and things like that. So they themselves became the object of an attack from the state. And they felt that like, there was a moment of huge disappointment for them. Like not only that Putin doesn't care about their husbands, but also because this state is actually not on their side. Actually, they're enemies, right? And that was a very painful realization for many of them, especially for those women who were like on the side of the state, who were loyal from the very beginning, right? And after all those encounters with different social services and state representatives, they just came to this very sad understanding that like, yeah, actually the state is not our friend here, right? So, and the third line actually was between husbands and their wives. And here we have like very interesting case. So some husbands and sometimes husbands and wives, they act together, right? So husbands, they support the attempts of their wives to bring them back home, right? Other husbands don't support those attempts. And that's super interesting because even despite that, their wives still trying to get them back, right? because they just simply cannot stop anymore. I was talking to one of those women, and she was talking like how her husband is like enjoying, I mean, he's like doesn't like it there very much, but they like have something, they build something in the forest, and they have like brotherhood there, right? And he's enjoying this like brotherhood, and he like tell her, okay, you're a traitor, you should stop criticizing all that. So his political position is very different. He's like pro-war, she's like anti-war, and she's still trying, she's still very actively, like she was super depressed, super disappointed, super burned out, and she was still very actively, despite of all that, just participating in the movement, doing everything she could to bring back her husband. And when I asked her about that, she was like, yeah, I just cannot stop now. So it's just, I cannot stop anymore doing that, even despite the fact that probably I will divorce with my husband. But yeah, I want it to be over. So if we think about the stakes of participation in collective action for those women who were the members of Bring Them Home movement. So what we see here, so obviously on the side of like factors which are against participation in any collective action, we have everything related to repression. So first, that's a huge fear of repression. Second, there are like this fear, it is not, I mean, there are like serious reasons for this fear, because even like before some of those women start participating in collective action, when they were just complaining, right? So they already started getting different sorts of like, yeah, like police people started coming to them and say like, well, what are you doing? Be careful here, right? So yeah, those like repressions, that were really very serious concern for those women. On the side of factors which actually push them toward participation in like collective action. So the first one, and this is super important, this is actually what makes this group different from any group, other groups of relatives who send their like husbands or sons to the army for some time, right? For drafted soldiers, for example. So first is temporality, because the problem with mobilization is that there is no term, there is no like end for this process. It's not discussed very much in Russian media or in any other media. It's just kind of like nobody wants to talk about that, but those people are there forever, right? And it took some time, over a year, for wives of those soldiers to realize that. But now it became a sort of push factor. It became like, okay, I do something now, try to get him back, or he come back only when the war is over, maybe in 10 years, or dead, or disabled. So those are my three options. And choosing between those options, I am just choosing to continue participating in this. Tactics, so disappointment in previous tactics. So they tried anything else. Those letters, meeting with deputies, requests, all those things, nothing has worked, right? And yeah, public actions, like participate, like interviews to non-desirable media and things like that, that basically became the only option. That's what they're saying. So it's just that's the state who making us radicals, right? So we don't want that, but we had to. Threat to life, to the life of their husband. So again, that's kind of just a very important factor here. Yeah, and the fact that actually it's not only the lives of their husbands which are involved in this whole situation, but again, that's the lives of their wives, because they kind of like got caught in between two worlds. They cannot live the normal civic lives as if nothing is happening. And they are not at war, but they are in some sense at war with their husbands, because they constantly emotionally and mentally are involved in it. That's interesting. So probably you remember, and this movement, it was criticized a lot at the very beginning for the fact that the wives of soldiers, they demanded only, the main demand was like, okay, we just want our husbands back, take another ones, right? That was the first slogans. It was literally sounded like that. So just second mobilization, bring like those mobilized soldiers back, take another one. That's how you can deal with this problem. But there was a certain dynamics there. So, and it was kind of like back and forth dynamics in a way. So like for many of those women, say they moved from their personal demands, I want to get my husband back, right, to more general demands because of their own experience, because of their own realization that like that's horrible to be a wife or the mother of mobilized soldiers. It's just not alive. It's impossible to live like that. It's like very dangerous for the members of the family. So that should be over, right? So like this whole thing is just, it should be over. Like no other man should be mobilized instead of their husbands or wives. But some other women, they kind of also, so there was also kind of like this move between like more general demands and more personal demands, right? So they're kind of like balancing, moving from this like general, that should be over, bring everything back, no more people should be mobilized. But then they moved to more personal demands when they got more exhausted. When they get more exhausted, and here's like the second quote here, when a young woman, she said like, okay, I am just, I look at those other women and I understand why they're saying that, just give me my husband, and I do whatever, just give me back my husband. And I understand why they're saying that, because me, myself, I was at some point that exhausted that I was just ready to do anything. Like she said, I'd make a deal with the devil just to bring him back. But that's out of sheer desperation. So yeah, in our interviews, we saw kind of like both those poles, right? And yeah, so many women that kind of was talking about that, how they were balancing between those two. What about the state, right? So how does it work? Did those women reconsider their ideas about the Russian state? Because again, as I said, we had both like kind of interviewees there, both like people who were very loyal to the state, who supported the war, and people who had oppositionist views. So, and they all had these experiences of encounter with the state. For all of them, there was a bad experience, not positive experience at all. And for many of them, there was also a shocking experience, because it was also very intense in a way that's not that was only they who just send requests and like make calls and meet different people, but it also like state representatives started reaching them and coming to their houses, right? And that happened pretty often, right? And like one of those women, she had, and she still has, I think, very like, she liked Putin, right? And she believed that this war was the right thing to do because because of all of those reasons, right? But then at some point, she had to have a surgery. She has a young daughter, and she called the social service and said like, okay, so now you took my husband, now you have to help to just deal me with this situation, right? So just give me some ideas here. What should I do? And they tell her, oh, okay, that's fine. We can organize, we can take your daughter and put her in a foster home, you know, for 2 weeks of your surgery. That's fine. And she was so shocked by that. And this, like the social service representative, I mean, she was like serious. She was like, yeah, that's fine. Just take your daughter. She's 4 years old, social service, like, yeah, foster home, that will be fine. Then you will take her back, of course. And she was so shocked by that experience that, yeah, she said like, that she faced with like care from the state, and it was like to bail out without a parachute and to hit the ground. So, and I mean, she was very loyal, and after that experience, she still like kept her loyalty there, but she was constantly just shocked with this. The second factor here is that the interaction with the state, it was not like non-problematic, not only because the state didn't respond to the requests of white, but because at some point state became their enemy, even despite the fact that they didn't want to be state's enemy, right? But the state like openly became their enemies because of those public accusations of like being spies, Navalnyists, and the enemies of Russia and Russian people. So yeah, there was just a public attack on soldiers' wives, and yeah, they were also shocked and affected by that. Besides that, there was also like a sort of a problem of broken promises. So you all heard probably about a social contract which exists within authoritarian regimes, when people just delegate the state, let the state do the politics in exchange for stability. So people don't intervene with politics and with state, they just stay away from the state, and state does not intervene with like people's personal lives. And this case of soldiers, the mobilized soldiers' wife, that was the case when state broke this very sensitive balance. And in many interviews, basically what those women said is like, okay, what is that going on? So yeah, we have like, we just don't want to intervene with anything that's going on with the state, but they make us to do that because they took our lives, they took our stability, and they don't give us anything back, even promises they don't give it to us. State, like the only one function of the state is to provide us with this stability, with this ability to live our normal life. We don't ask for anything more, just don't want to vote, please, stability. And the state took this stability from us, right? Not from all people, which would be fair, right? But only from us, only from these 300,000 families who now suffer because of that. And like, okay, so why is it going on there? Yeah, and what we see in many interviews is that, yeah, what's happening is that those, the members of this movement, they develop sort of like borderline identities. So they kind of like have both this old loyal identity when they try to justify the war, the action of the state, but they also start borrowing the narrative, like oppositionist narrative. They're like, yeah, of course, Navalny is like, was horrible, like the enemy of the state, but why they didn't let people protest, why when there was those rallies for fair election, they didn't want people to protest. So they don't want election, so what? That's kind of suspicious. So they also kind of like they start talking like using these pro-democratic narratives about like, okay, so they don't want people to vote, they don't want people to voice their opinion. Why is that going on? Why is it like that? So they kind of like their identities kind of became shattered with their experience. And yeah, I think that maybe I won't talk a lot about it, but yeah, it will come back to this question of why some people get mobilized and other people don't get mobilized. So there are actually a lot of factors here, and I want to stress only one. The interesting thing with this, the movement of the mobilized soldiers, of wives of mobilized soldiers, is that basically we have this movement because of the state, because the state created like artificially the group of people, right? Just by choosing those people, taking their wives, and then separating them, alienating them from the broader society, from the state itself, sometimes from their husbands too, right? So basically, like this group is a sort of like the result of politics, artificial actions of the state, right? But then we have another factor, the factor of the movement, because yeah, we see some, like we also, like if we come back to our first groups of people with mothers, right, and relatives, so we also see there are a lot of negative emotions. We also see that those people, they feel very lonely. They also see that they kind of like just don't feel that this is like the state helped them a lot, but the emotions, the emotions and their like cognition never reach like this point when they start drawing, when they actually create an identity, a very strong identity, which is like, the state is against us, the society is against us, nobody will have us, we can only be with people who are like us, wives of other soldiers, we are ready to do anything to get our husbands back because we have no choice there, right? So being the part of the movement actually helped them to build the pretty strong collective identity, which is surprising in Russia, because in Russia, like collective identities, it's like a hard thing to get. Okay, I stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia. Usually the prerogative is of the moderator to get the discussion going. So I'd like to start off with one question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. There's a lot of talk in the presentation about the role of the state, especially the wives' relationship with the state, but not as much about what the state is doing to either co-opt or undermine these organizations. So how successful do you see their ability to organize collective action, considering the government is well aware of this challenge, has parallel institutions that are trying to organize wives and mothers against this? And I think you talked a little bit on one of the slides about is using repression strategically. how does that fit into the equation for the probability of successful collective action going forward?
Yeah, well, very negatively, right? Because what we see even with the mother soldiers of St. Petersburg, so a lot of organizations and NGOs which try to like help relatives and soldiers to leave the army, they just, yeah, they're very much afraid of repressions, right? They're very much afraid of like those targeted repressions that they will become foreign agents or non-desirable organizations or like personal repressions. And that make them very, so what we found with NGOs that actually a lot of people, they have no clue that NGOs exist. They have like no clue that there are numerous organizations which are trying to help there. And this is happening because those organizations, helping organizations, they have very limited capacity to like publicly like promote themselves, right, and to do anything publicly. So yeah, they have like they make a lot of attempts to unite those people who found themselves in a very similar situations, but yeah, it's kind of like their abilities, their capacity is like super limited by repressions now.
Great, thank you. So let's open it up to the audience. Any questions from the group that's here with us in person, and also people that are joining us online? Please feel free to contribute questions and we'll get to them. Masha.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. This is a fascinating work, and I think an obvious question that probably everyone would be interested to hear your answer to. How did you interview those women? How did you get to them? They're in Russia and you are not. I
No.
understand that you may not be able or eager, willing to answer this question still. This is a question that arises. Also, of course, you mentioned soldiers' mothers of the time of the Chechen War, but there is another group of women in Russia, a group which is extremely persistent in asserting their rights. And these are the mothers of Islam after the horrific terrorist attack. And this is a group that has been active and persistent for 20 years. So it is not actually unique. And Mothers of Islam, just because this year was the anniversary, they once again very active and demanded, and actually Putin for some reason decided to go there and meet with them, which I think was a mistake from a political perspective. But they were adamant and totally uncompromising. So this is happening in Russia. A couple more small questions. You mentioned, I'm not sure how you described it, but the lack of solidarity. That this group is isolated and there is basically no sympathy in the society, not much interest either. Their protest actions when they take to the streets are not joined by anybody except themselves. And as you mentioned, their last protest was like 15 people, right?
Yeah, that was.
So how bitter are they about it? Is it something like a constant line, constant topic that our compatriots are not listening to us, they don't care about us?
Sorry,
Could I pause you there so we make sure we have time? We have about 10 minutes left for all the questions.
Okay.
Great, thank you so much.
I hope
You've given a lot of great things to talk
can you
about.
repeat like the last part of your last
About the
question?
solidarity.
Yeah.
I mean, how bitter are they about the fact that there's very little solidarity with their cause in the Russian society?
Well, they are pretty bitter about that. So, well, there are two things there. So first, they're observing like that a lot of people, they just live their normal lives, right? That's one part of it. But what you're talking about, that just that people don't join them at the rallies. So here there are some objective limitations. So for example, at those rallies, they don't even try to get more people there, I guess, because there are a lot of like police people there and provocators. And what they ask them like with cameras is just they want them to prove that they're actually relatives and wives of soldiers. So I don't think that they try to encourage people who are not personally involved in this problem to join the rally, because the situation now is that probably will harm them more than help. Yeah, and sorry, I forgot the first question.
The first was about how did you interview them?
Oh, how did it? Yeah, well, I can answer. Yeah, so we interviewed all of them online, and that was possible only because so with relatives of soldiers, mothers, fathers, daughters, we got their contacts from and permission to be interviewed from those initiatives, which helped them. So they first contacted those initiatives with like questions regarding their situations, and then they gave a permission to be interviewed by sociologists. And with the wives of the mobilized soldiers, well, like some people vouched for us. So they basically said to like women leaders in this movement, so yeah, you can talk to those people. They are fine, they're good. So that's the only way like possible. Yeah, and thank you for this remark about the Beslan mothers of Beslan. Yeah, we'll look at it too. I heard about that recently, but the thing with this initiative is, I think the important difference here is that it happened a long time ago, and it's not about a current situation. So, and that's why I think they are led to like still continue doing something, because it's a little bit a thing of the past, not that dangerous for the state now.
Other questions from the audience or online? Yes, please.
Sorry, I came in late, so maybe you've covered it in the beginning, but I was wondering how are they able to, how these groups are able to coordinate their public actions? Are they doing it in Kontakte, or are they just coordinating over cell phone, and whether or not they've experienced any sort of targeted crackdown on trying to disrupt their communications in the group and prevent them from self-organizing?
So they are communicating through social. So I know about Telegram. So they have a Telegram, this big group, Put Домой, right? And yeah, so they're communicating through social media. There are like a lot of small groups which are connected to each other. Each group has their own task, also some regional groups. And yeah, the thing is that there are some people who actually do not belong to those groups. And yeah, there was a recent scandal there, I guess, kind of 2 years ago, that some of like exchanges from messages from a closed group, it was published online, and then the members of the groups, they were accused. So yeah, that happens. That it's not that crackdown that they just tried to block the Telegram channel. I mean, they gave them a fake sign, and also the wives of soldiers, they are foreign agents, and also like several members now personally are foreign agents. But yeah, there were no attempts, so they don't have a site. So there were not attempts just to shut down, just cut them out of any resources of communication.
I think we have a question from online. From Yvonne. Oh, a couple questions actually. So Yvonne, well, what role does the topic of soldiers' salaries play in the way that the wives formulate their demands? In the new social contract, is money in exchange for soldier lives seen as fair or unfair?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I didn't talk about it because of the time limitations, but yeah, that's a very important topic. So yeah, those like husbands, they got quite a lot of money there, right? And we ask about like, what do they think about that? How did those money change the material situation of their families? So to the second question, the answer was that there was not that big of impact, because actually a lot of those money which the families got from the army service of their husbands, they just go back, because the husbands, they have to buy everything, they have to pay for everything. So sometimes actually they spend more than they receive. But also, it was the question of money was definitely the part of their narrative and their demands. And it sounded like, okay, so before this war, we already had an okay life. So just we both was working, we had our salaries, we were fine. Maybe not rich, but we were fine. So we didn't need those money. I wouldn't agree to give my husband in exchange for money. Thank you very much. No, we were fine before. So I think like one of my hypotheses was that maybe women who joined the movement, they were more or less not well off even, but like somewhere like lower middle class, something like that. So not tremendously dispirited and poor. But there is no way to like verify this hypothesis. But though it is possible, because all of them said like, yeah, we were fine before. We just had jobs. We had enough money to live. That was fine. Don't need money. Give back my husband.
So one more from, oops, and I screwed it up. From Lisa. Excellent presentation. I wonder if you have a sense of how exactly most of the women in this group became involved, what led them to join the group versus the mothers and wives you surveys interviewed who did not. So the participation in the actual formal organizations.
So they were actively looking for some information or advice or other people who were in the same situation as they were. And they were, so they were members of different like Telegram groups, for example, because there are numerous groups there and initiatives which are somehow just trying to do something or just discuss things, right? And the common story here is that basically many of them said, okay, so we were in this group and that group and that group, but they were only talking there, or they were just too much of like, oh yes, our husbands are heroes and things like that. But we wanted to do something about our situation. And this is how, when we found this group, put домой, bring them back home. So we stayed there, we joined them because they were actually, it was about action, not only about talking or like sending some things to the front line to help soldiers. So yeah, they were just trying different groups before like they found the one which actually fit their expectations and their needs.
More questions from the room? Yes, please.
Yeah, the compensation part of this for the husband, did it vary according to the size of the family, or was it just one set amount? And how did they come up with a figure for compensation?
Well, there is some fixed amount, and then it depends on the region and of some like other factors.
You know, it was growing.
Yeah, and it was growing too. So if you're from Moscow, you have a higher salary. If you're from like small village somewhere in the region, like there will be a smaller salary.
Do you think the presence of this resistance will affect the way that the Russian state recruits going forward, or do you think they'll ignore or marginalize the concerns that a lot of these people have communicated, especially because this demand for troops is just not going to stop anytime soon? Does this change the way that they behave towards society in any meaningful way?
Well, I think it is actually both. So they will try to marginalize those women. And I mean, that's what we're observing, right? Like this is just gradually happening. They became like foreign agents, now like personally foreign agents, then they got arrested, which was like pretty impossible like 6 months ago, right? Because it felt like that they are safe because that their wives of people who are fighting there, right? So they will continue to try to marginalize them. But I think that's like those cases, I think this is maybe the reason why like officially any like second wave of partial mobilization still not announced, because it is just dangerous, right? So that's why it's still continuing mobilization, right? So they just take people, they try to find those different ways to like pay more, to recruit people in like different strange ways. But I think that's why they don't announce the second partial mobilization, because it's just like very dangerous. Creates a lot of instability in the society and dissatisfaction.
Absolutely. Well, we've reached the end of our hour here, but I'm sure Natalia is willing and able to talk to people after the talk if you want to come up and ask more questions. Thank you all for coming. Our next talk is on October 17th? 15th. Maria Zalozhnaya will be joining us from the University of Iowa to talk about corruption in Russia. I hope you can make it. And thank you to everyone who joined us online and for contributing questions. This was